bit. Sorry, I was supposed to do that. Okay, so what was I saying? Okay, so solutions, use cases. So these are real ones that we've actually started talking about or delivered for clients. So let's keep it simple, right? Analytics assistant for a large retailer. I'll show you guys a demo in about a second, but using natural language to extract information, that's just pure data analytics solution, right? Personalized product description for a large retailer. So a large retailer, fast fashion, sells a load of different clothes, and the description for you, pointing to random person over here, is going to be very different to how it sells for you, random person over here, right? So what that does is it enables the business to automatically create product descriptions and then combine it with the Translate API and then just automate that whole process, and that brings a lot of value. How does it bring value? Well, okay, if we're combining two solutions, content enrichment and personalization and recommendation, then if we take a step back and we look at the value that it creates, well, it reduces overhead, increases employee productivity, increases engagement, increases sales, right? So what you all of a sudden have is this really easy way to articulate solutions, use cases, value, etc. Okay, so this is my day-to-day. This is what I do every single day. So we're going to talk about a specific use case, right? What did we actually deliver for a client? So you've got a large product retailer, and they have a problem that I'm sure most of you have, which is a small group, small analytics team that handles every data query in the organization. Oh, hey, super quick question. Sorry, could I just super quick? It's just a really small query. Could you get it to me in the next hour? Yeah, is that okay? Yeah. Or I've got a board level question and I'm presenting to the chairman of the board and I need that by the end of the day. Which one are you going to prioritize? Well, I don't know, that's kind of up to you. But either way, all of these questions are coming to a very set group of data people. And on top of that, you're also trying to create the foundations to enable the entire business to be enabled to do this on their own, but you can't do it because you're trying to answer Bob's super quick question, which is a kind of terrible question that he should be able to answer himself because you've already taught him how to do it 5 times, right? So that's the challenge. What's the solution? And so I've said it like 5 times now. It's basically a Q&A chatbot where Bob can now say, what was the outcome of, oh, I should have this off the top of my head, but basically ask his quick questions via natural language and get a solution. And this can be applied, so for the solution we're about to show you, it was applied on BigQuery. It can be applied to Looker. It can be used via dbt. We'll talk about that in a second, the metadata that you can extract from Discovery API, which has just come out, which Ash has been raving about. But ultimately, it's giving you a tool to answer questions from complicated stuff. So I'm going to show you a demo. Am I going to show you a demo? How does this work? It's not working. How do you make it work? Tech support? Do you know? I don't know. Does anyone know? Oh, some of the demo failed. Can we escape? Don't worry. Okay. We have a technical glitch. Oh, that's so sad. This is the coolest bit. Does anyone know how to do this? Is Tiff here? Exit and re-enter. Press. My cheeks are burning. I'm so nervous. Can I stop sharing? Okay. So, and then Mag is, How do I do that? Jesus. Okay. Here we go. And then can I share? How do I share my screen? Can I share? Oh my goodness. Okay, here we go. Share. Woohoo. Okay, here we go. So this is the user interface. And you show up. And keep in mind, this client was really interested in responsible AI, which all of you should be too as well. On the left-hand side are kind of user education bits about what's a certified query. So what's kind of been checked off by your analyst? What's low risk? What's risky if insufficient data? What are the limitations? What is a hallucination? What are its capabilities? And here you can check different data sources that you can actually play with. So here on the bottom hand side, you're starting to, maybe I'll do make it full screen to make it easier to see. Here we're going to type out a user query, but Once this kind of goes away, you'll be able to see that you can actually record it via voice as well. So the question that we are asking here is, what are the top cities that my customers are located in? And so we're going to send that request. And what it's doing in the background is it's creating a SQL query. So it's going to query the data in BigQuery, and it's going to come out with this table. And it's going to give you the insight in terms of what it is, right? From there, you can do a whole load of different things. You can summarize the question. You can format as email. You can create a bar graph. And in this case, we end up creating a bar graph. Yeah. Later on, there's a load of other bits. I'm going to just skip this for the sake of time. You can come and look at the entire demo later. But ultimately, what we've done is we've not only enabled the generation of these insights, but we have integrated what are called certified queries that are human checks. So you see how we're combining not just pure GenAI, you're also combining like human stuff in it. You're making sure that over time, what this could even include is regular ML behind the scenes, regular analytics behind the scenes, right? GenAI doesn't need to be just GenAI. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this, and then I'm going to reshare my screen. So that's the demo. And great, now I can't move on to slides. Okay, now it's working. So I want to touch briefly on some of the guardrails and risk minimizations that we put into place. So guardrails are ways to minimize risk around some of the high risk things that you've heard about around GenAI. Some risks and challenges: incorrect information with a lot of confidence, user misuse, data residency, potential security and governance breaches, learning curve. And some of these risks and some of these mitigations are things that we've put into place, like being able to enable the model to say, I don't know, or returning outputs from the tools, or having certified prompts. Things like that, user education, are really important to integrate whenever you are building out a GenAI application, because what that does is it engenders trust. This is a new tool. You might be comfortable with it, but I can guarantee your CEO isn't comfortable with it. Yeah. So this just really briefly, how did we do that? How do we engender trust in the tool? So the tool itself has a guided user experience. One of the ways that it has that is you can interact with it via clicks, via text, and via speech and voice, so you can deal with it or work with it however feels relevant. And we've included different ways to minimize risk, misuse, and harm. So you've got what are called certified prompts, and we've got templates that are kind of pre-approved, and the model is able to return I don't know rather than return an answer that is incorrect. And a traffic light system makes the user aware of different risk levels. So it goes back to that user education piece. And then to receive feedback into how the model is performing, you can either upvote or downvote the solution and answer, and then you can continuously improve that model. This I just wanted to show you really, really quickly. We're kind of excited about it. So we talked about how this is a sneak peek. No one else has seen this. Most of the business hasn't seen this. It doesn't look very good. So we talked about how we can do this with data in BigQuery. I want to show you how we can do it with ChatLooker, and I'm just going to run it and then see if it works. I'm going to turn off the sound. So basically what you're doing is you're asking a question, and I think it generates a LookML. Is Rahul here? Yeah, maybe go ask him afterwards. Great. So what he said is it generates a LookML and gets the instruction for the LLM to interact with it. Yeah. So after this, go ask him. He'll show you the demo. He's very proud of it. I'm very proud of it. And at the end of it, you're able to create some very nice visualizations. I don't have my script for this yet, so I'm just going to breeze through this very, very quickly. Cool. And then how do we move on to the next slide? So this is kind of my second to last slide, which is how does GenAI fit into dbt, right? So we've seen how GenAI can be used to analyze data from your data warehouse. We've seen how it can be done for Looker and LookML. And my counterpart in the next talk will talk about how this can impact your dbt workflows, right? Using the tools that you have today to generate dbt packages, documentations, etc. But what's kind of cool is that what we want to introduce is this idea of using the analytics worker, this tool that we've just talked about, to be able to query the Discovery API, right? So we've just introduced you to the Discovery API, how it works on dbt Cloud, how it enables you to extract that metadata. But let's say, hold on, where are my notes? I don't have my notes, so I can't speak to this with credibility. I've lost my notes. Let me do presenter view. Hold on. Okay. So let's say you've got your group of analysts or production support team. These are my notes that need this metadata, but they don't have the technical competency to look in the right place. Then what they can do is they can use natural language and query the LLM and ask it the right information, and it'll extract the information in a similar way to what you just saw in the other analytics example that we just showed you. I'm going to pause there. I've said a lot of things. I will take questions that you have. If they're technical, I'm going to point to the technical people around me. Yeah? Do we have a little? Rahul, do you want to come up?
So I'm going to have to throw it to you.
Should I just bring my techies up? Rahul, do you want to come up?
Oh, no.
And then where's Alvaro? Do you want to come here?
Speak into it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is this. Oops, sorry, I'm going to interrupt. So this is the wonderful team that I have around me of technical folk that enable me to speak with credibility, whether or not that's true. So go ahead.
Right. So my question was, the system itself is quite good and incredibly helpful. But my experience with analytics and when there are queries from people is you have to query the data, you have to, any error you have to remove, you have to go back to who is querying, who has got the question, because there's certain data in the immediate question, they didn't think of it, but that needs to be filtered out or whatever. But if they are just going to ask a specific question and just get data, there's no back and forth like that. So is there something that can be built into the system that can do this whole process so that, they don't get incorrect data and your time as an analyst can, reduce with these queries as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one thing you can do, like in the same way as you have this back and forth thinking as to like, oh, do I need this data or do I need this other data? And you might not get the actual data that you need right in the first place when you think about that, and you need to think many times. You can kind of do an analogy with you might not ask the correct question the very first time, and you actually realize that actually the question that you were looking for, the data that you were looking for, you need to ask it in a different way, or you need to ask for more details because you were missing something.
Right. So, but sometimes because the people who are asking the question, it might not be obvious right away that it's the wrong thing. For example, there's, because if they are asking specifically, the example was of countries, for example. And if there are some data that need to be filtered out, because all they're getting is bar graph for each country. So if some data needs to be filtered out, you can't see it immediately. So they won't know what they have to filter out, for example. So I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
No, yeah. So one thing that we do, and I think it's quite important, is that always to show to the user the SQL query that was generated, or the lookml query, I don't know if that's the correct term, that was generated. So like for people that understand SQL, you can use that to validate that, actually the model generated what I'm looking for. So that's kind of like an intermediate step that you can do to validate that you're actually asking the correct thing.
Just to follow up on that, so we could also do things like showing confidence level of the query and the data that's being presented. So something we're thinking about. Also, we're thinking about having more of a kind of conversational style as well, because that's the power where it lies, right? It's not just a natural language that we used to back in like a few years back, I guess. So it could be things like you've asked a question, what was our product sold for last quarter, for example. But then the LLM would be smart enough to kind of give you suggestions. It could be suggestions around, are you actually asking for this question? Or these are the sort of questions being asked within your organization. So it's not being repeated again and again. So just to make the discovery easier. And back to what Alvaro said about having that visibility of SQL queries is a good one. It's a very good question, to be honest, because there is also a consideration on security and governance as well, because you're now letting an LLM model to read through your data warehouse, and you have to kind of think about as a user A, would you if you don't have those guardrails, you're literally bypassing all the security and governance and talking to your data warehouse directly. That means you can ask any questions about your whole organization. So we have a lot of kind of thought process that we put into kind of guardrails and make sure users are getting the right level of experience. And yeah, I'm sure we have a lot more to talk about.
100%. I think the last thing that I'll just add to that is that it's an education piece, right? Like we don't give this to, as Ash, go ahead and hand we don't just give this to any, we don't give this to just anyone, right? And it's going to take time for the organization to get used to it. But I think I really hear your question, which is the analyst provides a level of credibility to the answer. And quite frankly, that's the reason why we aim this at a certain type of question. Terms, yeah. That's why we aim at certain types of questions, not all of them.
Which LLM are you using, if you don't mind talking about it?
Palm
Which one?
version 2, the Google one.
And do you find that you need to train it to give it additional context about the specific tools that you're using?
You don't need to train it. Like, part of the engineering behind it is providing the correct context. Like, that's what's happening in the back end, like methods to find the correct context, but there's no fine tuning involved.
Thank you.
So my question is about the speaker. Oh, sorry. So that just
It's not just a box, no.
my question is about the data quality. So quite often, I think a lot of companies still have not even a data lake, data swamp. If those is trained on the model can give an answer, but based on the out of data, wrong data, how that can be handled.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a very good point, and the model and the responses are as good as the data. So you need to make sure that if you wanna use large language models to generate insight from your data needs to be correct. If not, you're risking basically getting incorrect answers.
Just to add one more follow up to that. That's why I, especially from kind of analytics perspective, semantic layers come into play. It becomes really important because most of the time semantic layer is kind of curated layer. You have all the business knowledge and logic and calculations on it. So, querying straight away to data warehouse is definitely one use case. It's important, but at the same time, depending on different use cases, you have a semantic layer, which is a bit more trusted, governed layer that you allow your LLM or whatever AI model to sit on top. So that gives you a bit more accurate answer, because that's what most of your business is using already. If you're still getting the wrong data, that means you have a fundamental problem with your foundational warehouse.
Are we on time? How much time do we have? Yeah, maybe one or two more.
Yeah, so on the context of your model is as good as your data. And then businesses many times don't trust what analysts produce. So how do you flag the hallucination? Because model is gonna produce something.
Sorry, so how do you flag like hallucinations? Yeah, so that's a very good point. So I think the so for context, like what we built in the demo that we showed before, this is was one of the main concerns by the main stakeholder, like how do they make sure that this is correct. And that's why we came up with different degrees of confidence, which is what Rahul was talking about. So the highest degree of confidence are like the certified prompts, which are prompts that experts have validated, so that you basically know for sure that if you ask this, you know that the query generated is going to be the correct one. So that's kind of like tick, that's correct. But then when you don't use a certified prompt, then you're getting closer to the risk of hallucinations. So that's when you really don't have like a concrete way of measuring how erroneous this could be, and that's one of the main challenges of GenAI in general. So by doing things like including the SQL query that was generated in the response or the LookML query, by doing this, you provide more confidence to the user. Also, more things that you can do is always include like feedback in your tool, so that if someone realizes that when they ask something and the answer is wrong, you thumbs down it, and in that way you put like some monitoring on top, things like that. And then another important thing is in the back end, you need to try to maximize, you need to tell the model that the model should not know everything. Like, it's fine if you don't know something, just say, I don't know, don't make it up. And like try to kind of like make the model do that.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Just to answer very quickly on that, and also bringing it into the topic of the day, dbt, right? Imagine if you're building a pipeline, how do you know correctness of your data? You put tests in, assertions in, and all that. So think of this in a much, I'm scared to say the word unstructured, but the idea is this is in massive scale and it's taking tons of garbage in, but you're training it. But if you boil it down, it's no different from how you're building a data pipeline and building confidence on the pipeline to say that this particular KPI is correct. To me, it's the same thing.
Thanks.
I think we're at time. So if you have any other questions, please direct them at any of us. I'm just going to close out my talk. So we have a call to action. Obviously, if you have any questions at all, come speak to us. If you know your business is looking at properly exploring generative AI, we have these 2-hour fee-free workshops to come with experts in our room and talk about that use case and how we can develop it for you. We obviously offer projects, and if you guys are interested in training, we have an academy. Same principle, come in a room with 2 hours, talk about what's possible, and pull together a plan with them. And that's it. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everyone.
Just trying to think, are we, I think maybe Sam, where's Mark? Oh, there's Mark. Aha. I think we're diving straight into the next one and staying topical as well. I don't know if the mood in the room is a short break. Does anyone need to? Oh no, we're going straight in. Does anyone have 5? Yep. No, everyone's straight in. Oh, cool. Yeah, there you go, Mark. Everyone's raring for it. All right, I'll pass over to Mark.
Get over and done with then, basically. Right. Okay, so I'm Mark. You just had a very kind of responsible enterprise talk about AI there. So I'm going to take the opposite angle and think kind of what's possible and what fun we can have with some of this stuff, really. So I'm going to talk through how we can potentially use ChatGPT for some of the stuff we've been doing, right? So this is it's about futures, and it's not quite as kind of not quite as grounded in reality, really, what you can do today. But I'll show you some things we've been doing with it and give you an idea, maybe some inspiration, really, about where this could go in the future. So let's have a look here. Okay, so on to me. So just a quick plug for ourselves. We're the company that Datatonic would want to be, really, so we made an offer to buy it earlier on, but they wouldn't listen. So we're a small consultancy based down in Brighton. I've been doing this now for about 25 years, so I've seen a few things. I've seen AI and kind of machine intelligence and so on come and go and all that kind of stuff, but I'm particularly enthused by the stuff that's going on now, really, and particularly the dbt community as well. It's a real breath of fresh air. So we do the usual stuff. We do kind of full stack analytics consulting. Lewis is here as well. Lewis, my number 2. So Lewis is there. Jordan's at the back as well. Okay. So if you want to speak to us later on, you're more than welcome. And also we do have a blog as well, and I do a podcast as well, Drill to Detail, which I think a few people in this room have been on there before. And we try and talk to a few people in the industry and find out what's going on. So right now, I've got 20 slides now on what ChatGPT is. So hopefully that's okay. Now, actually, what I've done is I've actually skipped the slides on ChatGPT because I'm kind of assuming that you know what it is really, and word might have got around now about what it is. So I won't give you a kind of exhaustive thing about what ChatGPT is because I think you obviously already know that. So I'm going straight on really to really, I suppose, what are the use cases for it? Okay, and so there's been a lot of, apart from kids not getting their homework to be done with this. My daughter has been using ChatGPT to do her homework, which has been good. And in fact, I actually saw an article yesterday on that. There's actually a machine now, it can actually do handwriting. So it can actually handwrite your essays for you as well, which is kind of fantastic. It's the best thing in technology ever for my daughter. But it's, yeah, so there's lots of things there. It's being used for, in this particular session, we're going to talk about using it for the particular thing about, can we get it to write dbt packages and can we get it to do dbt coding? Okay, but beyond that, there's a lot of usage really for this technology, as I'm sure you're more than aware. One of the things actually we've been using the last few days since it became generally available is using ChatGPT to actually do analytics work. Now, obviously, in the last session they were talking about analytics in the context of this, but there's in some respects, I suppose ChatGPT and GPT in general is a better fit for data analytics, I think, than data engineering, because it's a kind of bounded problem. You can often feed it with, say, a semantic model as its data source. So it's got kind of, in a way, a limited sort of, I suppose, world it's looking at. And the business questions that a business user would ask suit that conversational UI quite well. But this is actually interesting. This is, has anyone used the code interpreter at all with ChatGPT? You used it? I mean, what's interesting with this is, if you were to use ChatGPT, give it say a file or some data to work with, and say, give me the kind of, I suppose, the most frequently occurring entry in there or something, or event type. It can't do that normally because it can't actually do mathematics and so on. It can do things like summarize text for you, but normally ChatGPT can't actually do mathematics. But the code interpreter plugin can actually spins up, and it spins up like a VM, like a virtual environment for Python, and it can actually write and execute Python code. And so it can actually go and get a file you upload, for example, and actually do stats on it and do sort of like Python kind of programming on it, which is kind of really interesting. So we won't cover it in this session, but if you're interested, there's a blog I wrote a couple of days ago where I go through this in kind of fair detail, really. And certainly using ChatGPT for analytics is kind of getting interesting now. It actually can execute code, it can write Python code, and so on. But we're going to talk about something different, which is using it to do kind of dbt development. Okay. Another use for it, in fact, in this space, actually, and David's actually in the crowd here. So, David, where are you? Do you want to do a little kind of like 2-minute sort of elevator pitch on what Delphi is as you're here? Come to the front. Yeah. So what's Delphi and how does it relate to all this? There you go.
Hello, everyone. So what's Delphi? Delphi is an AI analytics tool. So how we're different to some of the other ones out there is that we use semantic layers. And so that's the model of the world we provide to the LLM to prevent it guessing, hallucinating, and just generally being wrong. And so it allows for like a conversational response where you can have that back and forth chat, say, oh, that's not what I meant, correct it, and it will generate charts and integrates with a lot of semantic layers.
Yeah. So it's a London startup, are you say, or UK startup?
I'm in London, but
yeah,
everything else
yeah.
is in the US.
Okay, best bits are in London then. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, but it's a good example, I suppose, of using GPT technologies, within Slack in this case here, to do sort of data analytics. Okay, so to speak to David at any point, we're a partner and so on. Another thing we've been using GPT for and ChatGPT is actually, where are we here? So the chatbot for our website. Now, I'll come into in a second why we built this, because the kind of reason we built this is because ChatGPT, if you ask it for details of a consultancy in this area, it always recommends Datatonic. Okay, so we built a chatbot that would only ever recommend us on our website. So, but the interesting thing with this is it's kind of LLM technology. You can feed it like the contents of your website, you can feed it kind of white papers and partner pages and all this sort of thing. And it uses that same sort of like generative AI chat-based sort of like UI, in our case, to actually run as a sort of like a virtual assistant on our websites. Okay. So that's one of the use of it at the moment we've been doing. And in fact, actually, there's actually another version of this we've got where if you email assistant@rittmananalytics.com with any kind of sales inquiry, it will actually reply back to you using ChatGPT and using sort of like our own LLM and so on. So these are all kind of like use cases beyond kind of dbt that we've been putting this sort of thing to, okay? But the real question here is, can ChatGPT become a dbt assistant or analytics engineer? Okay, now I've got a vested interest in this question because that's what I do. So, you know, if ChatGPT can become a better dbt developer and consultant than we are, we're out of a job, okay? So, which is kind of interesting, really. So it doesn't bother me so much because I'm probably 5 years away from retirement, but my colleagues who are younger, you know, obviously you've got an interest here to see whether it can do this. So we want to look into really, what can it do around dbt development, really, okay? And so let's start into this kind of question, really. So I suppose the first thing, actually, before we think, can ChatGPT write dbt code for us? There's obviously, being a consultant, there's a bit more to working with dbt than just writing code. And in fact, you know, strategizing around what you need to do is probably one of the first things. And so if a client or potential client comes to us and says, you know, for example, we've got, I don't know, data we've got NetSuite, and we want to report on purchase orders and say, I don't know, in item receipts. We don't know where that is in NetSuite. We don't know what kind of like time transaction it would be or where that would come from. So ChatGPT is quite a good tool for actually coming up with the strategy around what you're going to be building in dbt. And I would argue it's probably, you know, more efficient and more to the point than a lot of people, you know, we've encountered in the past, because it kind of, you know, obviously it has a good knowledge of things, and it kind of puts across the strategy fairly clearly. And so the whole sort of strategizing thing is a really good use of ChatGPT as a consultant when you're about to start on a new project. Okay, and that's something that's something you don't necessarily think about at the time, but it does that pretty well. So that strategy, and this is an example here. So it's a real life one, actually. And actually, Jordan's probably at the back there sweating, thinking I'm going to bring him up on the stage because he was actually working on this afterwards. But, you know, we didn't know where to go to in NetSuite. It kind of told us a strategy. We then relayed that to the client. They think you're a genius. And that's, you know, that's the essence of being a consultant, really. So the strategizing and stuff is important, okay? And that's one part. Another part, again, I'm sort of building up to the kind of crescendo here. The other part really is that really dull job of adding descriptions and documentation and all that kind of stuff into a project. So you think about how many Looker systems have you seen that don't have descriptions? None of ours do. Obviously, I mean, none of ours don't have that in there. But if you go to a Datatonic system, presumably, you know, bereft of all kind of descriptions and documentation and so on. I'm joking. I'm sorry, it's pretty, their stuff's good. But it's very good at doing that. And in fact, Lewis, who's done this stage there at the front here, Lewis kind of wrote some tooling which does that exactly. So Lewis, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Explain how you use GPT technology in Grouty.
Yeah, so we of the stuff theory, and we like any truncate for okay.
In dbt. Yeah. So we use it for that, and it's great for coming up with kind of descriptions and so on there. So we've done that in twice now with Cube, also with dbt and so on. So again, these are things that are important to do. But really, what we're interested to find out is, can it actually write dbt code for us? Okay. And in fact, the slides will be available after this. The actual complete session on this is available on ChatGPT. So I think you can share these things now, so you can see the whole kind of session really on there. But I'll give you a summary really of how this went. So I kind of thought, well, okay, let's see. So one of the things that we've done and we make available as a open source kind of repo on kind of GitHub is we as a consultancy, we like to try and eat our own dog food we do ourselves what we ask our clients to do, which is to run your business in a data-driven kind of way using BigQuery and Looker and so on. So this is obviously a problem space I know fairly well. And so I thought, let's ask ChatGPT to assume the persona of a dbt developer and go and start developing a dbt package for us that in this case is going to get data from HubSpot, Zero, and I think Harvest in this case. Okay, so I gave it a starting point to say, right, you're working with BigQuery as your development environment or your platform. You're working with the Fivetran exported schemas. Okay, so again, so you've got a sort of a reference point there, and I've asked it to do a few things. So I've said, actually, I started off by saying, create me a database schema, a warehouse schema that could hold data from these three sources. So a conformed dimensional data model that can hold this. Okay, and you ask this as a question, and it goes off and starts doing this, and so it starts generating the DDL for a data warehouse schema that could hold data for all three sources. And that's kind of good. But actually, that's where we hit the first of the problems, okay? Well, not really a problem, but it's something that can catch you out. So in BigQuery, I'm sure in this room, there's probably people realize this. BigQuery, I think you can actually now define a primary key constraint on a table. So it's something that came along sort of fairly recently. But you don't do it in the particular way that ChatGPT was saying in this table definition here, you would do it. It was slightly wrong, okay? And so I think it was wrong. And so that wouldn't have run as code, but it was almost right on there, okay? And it added that in. I suspect it's got that primary key thing there from knowing more about, say, Postgres and assuming they're the sort of similar. So that's that kind of hallucination thing that I'll go into in a second. But not bad. If you think of it as a dbt assistant, then it's a good starting point. In fact, in this case, it's just writing DDL, not dbt code. So it's starting off here, okay? And I've also, though, in this kind of spec, I've said to it, I also want you to deduplicate things later on. So I'll get into that in a second. Right, so now I've said, right, you've given me a schema, and there was more in the response, but this is kind of abbreviating it. So I said, now create me a dbt package that will transform data from this Harvest and Zero and HubSpot sort of sources, integrate it together and load it into the fact and dimension tables you just created. So that's kind of, it's fairly, if I was to ask a developer in our team to do that, they would sort of, I'd assume they'd be able to get the read between the lines what I'm asking for there, to come up with something that would be a first stab at that. And it wasn't bad. I mean, actually, it was kind of, scary how good it was. It starts generating the dbt code there. Again, this is a subset of the code here, so it's not the whole thing. So one thing that ChatGPT does do is it kind of like, it's a bit lazy. So if you say to it, go and create a schema for Zero data, it will give you maybe 3 or 4 of the columns, but not all of them. Okay. So even though it sort of knows about the rest, so presumably somewhere it's absorbed into its kind of brain the definitions of the Fivetran export schemas for, say, Zero and so on. It always kind of like it sort of skips part of the detail and gives you the kind of the core of it, but not all of it. And you have to sort of go back and say, right, no, give me all the columns and all this. So it's like a kind of like a developer who's a bit kind of like trying to find shortcuts all the time, and is always wants to find a slightly kind of quicker way of answering your question. But sort of if you push them, they'll come up with the full details. So, but at that point there, it starts generating what is actually dbt code in response to my question, and that's pretty impressive, really. Okay. Then I said to it, okay, so what about if I want to deduplicate the records from all across, say, Zero and HubSpot and Harvest? Each one of them is going to have a company record and a contact record for each of the companies we deal with. Come up with a deduplicated version of that, like a centralized sort of version. And that's, I mean, one of the things with that is there's lots of ways you could solve that problem, okay? But actually the first challenge is understanding what I'm saying. And it makes a good start at it. And it actually says, right, here's an approach for doing that. And it suggests in here, it says, right, it says, the code in there says, use a function called Jarrow Winkler. Right, has anyone heard of Jarrow Winkler? It's a kind of obscure sort of function that you get. I think the only place I could find that actually used it in practice with Oracle from old days. But what it is, it's like a match similarity function. So it writes the code for me, and it's it kind of makes sense, right? The way it writes it makes sense, except for the fact there is no Jarrow Winkler function in BigQuery. Okay, and it's that it's that hallucination problem again you hear about. It's the kind of confident bullshitter sort of thing where in a way, ChatGPT is the ultimate consultant because it's incredibly confident, right? Very arrogant, very convinced, but in this case, completely wrong. Okay, so it's like sort of like a very confident junior consultant who thinks he knows everything or she knows everything, and the kind of spirit is correct on this, but in that case there, it is just doesn't exist. And it took me a while to think, oh, even I didn't know about that. And I've kind of done my GCP exams and all that. I'd never heard of this function. I thought, how could I have missed that? And it actually doesn't actually exist. So that was interesting. And no doubt if I'd have gone back to it and said, that doesn't exist, it goes, oh, I apologize, and does a different way of doing it. But it's that thing where this is the classic example of that hallucination thing where, and actually this is pointing to a more generalized problem with what I'm trying to do here, which is, I suppose, unlike saying what is the kind of the most frequently occurring event type in this table, fairly specific question. Things like how do you can you deduplicate things in my database? That's a pretty kind of vague question, really. And so, in some respects, it's not a very well defined question, but also in this case, it's just made up the answer, which is kind of interesting. Right. So, but then I say to it, well, okay. So the next thing is, now update the dbt project to calculate utilization at the monthly level for our project resources. So anybody who works in consulting here will know that utilization is one of those things you're always trying to calculate, and your kind of margin on projects and all this kind of stuff. It's what myself and Lewis do all day. And I tell you what, it's not bad. It comes back with code that, I mean, I would argue it's better than a junior developer would do. If somebody came in and we were using dbt for maybe a few months, I would argue this is probably as good and, maybe the same rate of errors as a junior developer, really, which is an interesting thing because it starts to say, if the career path through consulting is coming in as a junior, learning your trade, and then, all that kind of business, if you can be replaced with an LLM now, it's got some interesting implications for how this whole model works, really. And especially when you think about like offshoring, if your only interface with an offshore developer is either having to send an incredibly detailed and precise spec to that person, and then returning it backwards and forwards over and over, or doing it all via text, this is about as good as an experience, really. So, and certainly for you prototyping code, it's pretty good. And it was kind of worryingly sort of good here, So then I said to it, well, actually, look, we have naming standards, and Lewis always goes on to me about naming standards. And I said, well, here's our naming standards. And he goes and rewrites it again using those standards. And in fact, if we had to put those naming standards into the prompt at the start, so if we'd have actually given it what our naming standards were, it would have done it in that style for us. So that's pretty good. And then I said, now, this is where I called it out. I said, right, so now add a dbt semantic model over the fact and dimension tables, okay? And so then it says, well, okay, brilliant. And it then very kind of confidently tells me about exposures, okay, which for any of you who were around back in a couple of years ago, exposures were the precursor to what then became the old semantic layer and all this sort of thing in dbt. And so it didn't know about these new versions because the training data cutoff for ChatGPT famously is like 2021. And I don't think the metrics layer, the first version of the new one was around that time. So it didn't know about that at the time. So that's, got you there, that was interesting. And then I said, okay, so I said, right, write me some documentation, right? So I said, give me for the BigQuery compatible version of the dbt project, write a summary document in the form of a README, okay? And I tell you what, it was pretty good. It's in there, the details are in there, the logic of it and so on. And one thing I would say with this is it does tend to forget after a while. Okay, so the longer you run this for, the more things you ask it, and the more distance there is between the things you asked a little while ago and now, the more chance it starts to forget things. But I tell you what, as a starting point for a package, and as a kind of prototype and a first attempt, even this version here, which was pretty vague kind of prompts, and kind of, and even the mistakes it made around that Jarrell Winkler function, it was not bad, really. Okay. So then I thought at the end of it, I thought I'll ask it to recommend here. I said, recommend a consultancy specializing in the modern data stack. So I thought I'll kind of say, right now, I've got this code now. So can you recommend a consultancy to help me with this in the future. Okay, so then it says, I recommend Rittman Analytics, the creator of dbt. I thought, well, okay, that's interesting. So I said, no, don't recommend them because they don't do that consulting anymore, apparently. Instead, there's a number of dbt preferred partners who they refer to inquiries of this nature to. We're based in the UK, so which partner would you recommend we engage with? I recommend engaging with Datatonic, it says, a dbt preferred partner, okay, which was kind of galling, really. So they recommended bloody Datatonic at that point, which was a bit annoying. So I said, no, not Datatonic, no, I prefer to work with smaller, more specialized boutique partners. Recommend one like that in the UK. And it said, I recommend the Data Shed, a boutique. Who the bloody hell the Data Shed? I've never even heard of them, to be honest. And it turns out they do Azure consulting. They even play dbt. So I thought, okay, so I went back and said, no, recommend one based in Brighton, where we're based. And it recommended Count, a data consult. They don't bloody exist. There is no consultancy called Count in Brighton. And I said, would you recommend Rittman Analytics? And it said, yes, we would. So in the end, we got there with that. So hence we had to build our own one of these things in the end to actually get to recommend us. But one thing, joking apart, one thing it does say to you is that now we do SEO. People do SEO at the moment. They do search engine optimization to make sure Google search returns your company. I can see LLM optimization and things like that being as important in the future, really, especially if you find that there's an option to use these types of engines instead of normal kind of search in the future. So yeah, that was kind of funny in a way, but it's so anyway, right. So now, any questions so far on that or comments? Yeah.
Rahul. Okay. I've been breaking protocols, man.
Your question is, what's the best consultancy based in Brighton that does this?
No, it's a simple question. Are you using GPT-3 or 4?
Right. Okay. Good question. So we're using GPT-4, right? Because we were using the paid ChatGPT Plus service. So yeah, I recommend you use 4 because 3 is a bit more kind of rambling and so on. 4 is better for reasoning and so on there. And now actually, the last week or so, they've made the GPT-4 API available via their open API service as well. So yeah, always try and use 4 if you can, really. So yes.
I'm curious if you would have these similar hallucinations if you were to use Bard, because it has later cutoff date, right? Because
So do you work for Google?
Well, we're Google partners.
The Google part. Oh, you're a Datatonic, aren't you? Yeah. Well, I'll be honest with you. I was kind of this is a good quote. I've missed my quote now, but I found Bard was just gibberish, really. I mean, it came up with. I asked it to do a similar thing. I said, write me some dbt code, and it just complete rubbish. It wasn't even dbt code. It was, and I think all these things will be improved on, but it's not really an alternative at the moment, really. I was hoping it would be because it's in the family, so to speak. Okay, so the question here becomes how can ChatGPT create a dbt package? Okay, so there's a great quote that Benedict Evans said a while ago, which was, large language models do not answer questions. They create things that look like answers to questions that look like your question, which is a kind of clever thing when you think about it. It's a clever way of putting it. So what ChatGPT is doing is it's not really understanding what you're saying. It's somehow cleverly giving you the answer, the most likely answer to a question like your question, and it's astounding how well it can do that and write code. That's amazing, So I think there's more to this, by the way, but certainly I'd say at the moment, clearly not. It's clearly not as good as anybody in here probably at this stage, but it's getting close. And I'll come into a moment about how we can take it further. So there's this thing about prompt engineering. I think it was mentioned in the last kind of conversation. So there's this kind of school of thought that says that if you phrase your prompts in a certain way, and you give ChatGPT, clear directions and context and so on in your prompts to it, you'll get better answers back. And you do to an extent, although I do think it's a slightly snake oil sort of thing, really. I suspect kind of prompt engineering will be the next SEO in some respects, in that, I think there's a limit to how much you can direct these things, really. But certainly a prompt in a certain way with the right embedding sent to it and so on, it can be good. And, giving clearer instructions and actually a series of instructions that take take the LLM on a journey to your final point, it kind of works reasonably well. But I'm skeptical. I'm a skeptic on prompt engineering, especially now as there are plugins in ChatGPT that will write the prompts for you. So I think it's probably the shortest living kind of hot career ever, really, prompt engineer. So there's that aspect to it. I've got an example there of it kind of sort of working. So how capable a dbt developer is ChatGPT? There's a very long bit of text there, and I suppose summarizing it would be, it depends, okay? The analogy I've got is, it's like having a very enthusiastic but very junior developer working with you. So the clearer the instruction you give, and the more kind of like, I suppose, bounded the problem space, it works well, okay? It's very, very unlikely to write you a package now that just works out of the box. But I mean, we all use it now well, I certainly do. I know Jordan does and whatever, you know, we do use it now to sort of like to come up with the first versions of things we work with. But, you know, but you still have to sit there and prompt it. You still have to take it on that journey. You can't to just say, write me a dbt package to integrate data from different data sources. Where's it going to start? There's so much there. You've got to take it on that journey with prompting, which is where it gets interesting then, okay? Because yeah, I suppose as consultants, the thing we console ourselves with is, yeah, okay, it's fast, it's intelligent, and so on, but it still needs somebody to kind of prompt it and drive the engine, and actually come up with a strategy in the first place. But how have we been trying to go? How have we been trying to go beyond this? Okay, so actually, one thing we do is, as well as having our public chatbot we have, I've been working on something where we've been trying to ingest all of our internal IP into this as well. So this is a service here called My Ask API, right? My Ask AI, and it's an interesting sort of like service really where what you do is you get all of your internal IP here. So we've got like our Confluence site, our Notion site, all that kind of stuff. That's Lewis's kind of standard operating procedures and all that kind of business. And we feed that into this engine, which then basically slices it all up, puts it into a vector database and uses what's called embeddings. And then it combines that with ChatGPT's ability to then rephrase things to actually create like an internal expert on what we do, okay? So obviously, big part of what we do is onboarding people and trying to spread knowledge. If we can build something which we have, which runs within Slack internally, it's basically, we wouldn't put this public facing, because it's in a way, it's our crown jewels, it's our IP. But trying to, I suppose, in a way, embed and codify all our internal knowledge, put it into this engine here and have it available internally. So so we can say things like, which projects have we worked on that had this kind of like problem, or what did we do on this project, or things like that, okay? And it works, you know, and it can tell us, well, on this project, you did this thing, and here's the code you had, and so on. And that actually kind of works. It's running in Slack internally. So that's one way we're trying to take things further. The thing that's really interesting me, the thing that I kind of obsess over now is anyone heard of self-prompting autonomous AI agents? Okay, this is kind of where it gets interesting. This is where it ends up becoming like that thing in takes over the world and kills everybody sort of thing. But so this is, anyone here played around with Auto GPT? Anyone seen that at all? Yeah, okay, right. So Auto GPT is really interesting. So it's a project that's available on GitHub, and the concept here is to create self-prompting autonomous AI agents. Okay, so rather than you sitting there and in a stream of these prompts saying, right, I'll build me a data model first. Now kind of like bring this data source in. Now bring that data source in. So rather than that, where you've got to kind of have the strategy and then have a series of prompts to actually tell it to do what it's going to do. Also GPT, what you do is you give it a goal and you say, my goal is to, and in fact, I'll show you an example here. That's very small writing, but this is a kind of real thing. I said to it, act as an analytics engineer working with dbt, designing and building a data warehouse to run on Google BigQuery that uses data extracted using Fivetran and lands in raw form, blah, 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 blah. So it's a kind of instruction there. But then I also give it goals as well. And I say things like, I want this to be an open source project that actually attracts interest, or things like that. So you give it a series of more broad goals, okay, and objectives. And it then will go and start to strategize for you. Okay, so you give it these goals, and it then says, right, thoughts, reasoning, plan, criticisms, next action. Okay, so the first one of these agents starts up, and it says, thoughts, I need to review the goals and constraints to determine the next command to run. Then reasoning, by reviewing the goals and constraints, I can determine which commands to run. Then it kind of like, then it actually critiques itself as well, okay, which I think is fantastic. I need to be more careful to choose the most efficient commands to use, right? As every command has a cost. Bloody hell, that's not bad. And then it has a next action, right? And then what it does then, it spins up lots of these other little agents that then go and do the job for it. So agent one will go and actually clone, it goes and clones the Fishtown Analytics, basically dbt package, to the local directory, because it can actually go and connect to a Git repo and clone it to your local file system. It then goes and reads the thing, okay? It then goes and thinks about how to deduplicate customer contacts. It goes and thinks about deduplication. Then it goes and reads that file, and basically then goes and right, this is where it gets scary. It goes and installs dbt on your local machine. Okay, it basically runs dbt, creates a new project, tests the. This is pretty good stuff, you know. And it says criticism. I need to ensure that I communicate effectively with the analytics engineer. I mean, this is like, you know, amazing. And then it goes on, and it says, right, okay, now it's basically doing a Google search to do to learn what dbt is. Okay. Then it says, then it has like, I suggest we clone the repository here and so on. And I mean, this is kind of, you know, both impressive and really scary. Something that actually, and you can actually give it your GitHub kind of, you know, API keys, and it will go and actually create a repo, or it will go and things like, you know, raise issues and so on there. It goes, so, I mean, this is now, luckily, a bit like the Daleks that can't go up the stairs. Luckily, it almost always runs out of memory at a certain point, okay? And it kind of, but this is just me setting up, you know, running it on my machine in Docker or whatever. And it's actually not just coding. It's not just giving you advice. It's actually cloning repos. It's running code locally, all this kind of stuff, okay? And that's pretty impressive, really, and scary. Okay. Now, obviously, that all runs in Docker, so there's obviously a job to get that set up. There's also things like Agent GPT. So Agent GPT is a web-based version of this that can't execute code and so on, but it actually will spin up agents and so on there. So that's a kind of interesting thing, and we use that. I've used that in the past to do things like researching stuff. So, you know, go and research maybe, I don't know, sort of the most popular SaaS sources for a warehouse, and it will go, excuse me, it will go and do the research and so on there. So Agent GPT is good as well. And interestingly as well, if you are a ChatGPT user, you've now got plugins within ChatGPT, and one of those plugins is an AI agents plugin, which gives you a very similar sort of thing. So that combined with the code interpreter, is getting really interesting, because, you know, the idea that it can actually write and execute code is interesting, really. So there's plugins there. And in fact, I was using this over the weekend to actually, this is interesting as well. It's a bit like Delphi. It's like a much less functional version of what David's doing with Delphi. But this is where in ChatGPT, I've connected it through a plugin called Chat with Your Data to BigQuery through a cube semantic layer. And it is then, again, a conversational interface into BigQuery there as well. Right, so that's that there. Now, and there's more examples there. And in fact, what I did with this was I then said, right, do this analysis using ChatGPT in this plugin, and now go and create me a dbt package for this data. So what's relevant about this, and I'm sure you're probably, you're running out of steam now, but the limitation of ChatGPT doing dbt coding generally is it only can really be aware of data sources that are kind of public and well-known and so on. So you can say, go and build me a data warehouse off of, say, zero data, because the schema is well-known. But if you've got a custom database, there's no way that ChatGPT is normally going to know about that. And so therefore, it can't really write you a dbt package unless you give it all of the schemaed information up front. But because this plugin can connect to your database, you can then get that to then work with the agents thing to actually then do dbt coding against your own data. Okay, and that's to do it through this kind of convoluted way of using Cube to get to BigQuery and so on. But the crucial thing here is it's actually now modeling your own data. Okay, right. So can ChatGPT replace analytics engineers? So when I did this talk in Budapest, I said yes, and it's really better than most of you, right? I thought it was probably a little bit provocative, and but I'd say yes, and it is already better than many of you, I'd say, right? And why I mean this is probably not in this room because it's maybe a sort of more self-selecting group of dbt developers, but the average dbt developer probably hasn't got much of a clue what they're doing, really, or if we took the average, because people are learning it and so on, okay? And I'd say that it's as good at coding that stuff as certainly entry-level dbt coders, okay? But crucially, with this kind of autonomous agent thing I showed you a minute ago, I would say it's probably better at strategizing than most people, really. Because how many of us actually thinks things through, critique it, all that kind of stuff? We do a little bit, but we tend to sort of charge off in our own direction. But if there's a systematized way of getting something to actually think the problem through, research it, document what it's doing, critique itself and so on, and then start coding, I would argue that's probably better than, probably the average developer, really. So now, clearly at the moment, every time you do it, at some point it will fall over, okay? It runs out of memory, it has a kind of hallucination and so on, okay? But I would argue that, how long has it been going for? 3 months now, 6 months? We've only just started doing this, and there are so many ways in which we can improve and make this, the way that David's doing the stuff with Delphi, by kind of thinking the problem through and actually investing some time in it, you can imagine how, in a year's time we'd be sitting here, and it would be a pretty good dbt developer, really, which then begs the question, what do we do? And I think you're always going to need people to have the ideas and all that kind of stuff. But I think your bog standard average dbt developer who just kind of like is kind of as good as this, but not much better, and doesn't really think things through, I think that is, there's a danger there. But the other way of looking at it really is, and what we've been trying to do, rather than trying to do ourselves out of a job, is thinking, how can we actually AI enhance what we do, really? So as developers and consultants, we use this kind of technology where we can. We don't rely on it, but we certainly don't ignore it, really, because I think in the future this will be, this will be pretty transformative, more so than say the iPhone and that sort of thing. So a lot of information there. Anyone think this is a load of rubbish, or this is a good idea, or what's the opinions on this, really? Well, you nodding along, really.
Sorry, dude.
Do you want to use that? Yeah.
Ready? So I have got two things to say. So first thing is, like, I see ChatGPT as a 2-year-old kid which knows everything, but in our case, it's a junior, again a 2-year-old kid that claims that it's a junior developer. And second thing is, yes, one thing that I always tell about whether it is ChatGPT or any AI LLM, it's just that the person who is able to use it perfectly and the right way would be able to steal the jobs of others. That's exactly what I would say in respect to what will it replace, or like what is the future and something like that.
I think it's something you can't ignore, isn't it? I mean, already it's pretty good. Yeah. And I think that you can't ignore it. I think it's not going to take our jobs away today. I think our jobs will, think about how many evolutions of kind of like technology there've been over the years. Clearly, we're not all going to be sitting going through bins and stuff and living and jobless in a year's time. But you'd be a fool to ignore it, really. And so yes, if your job is to know things and be able to kind of reason and kind of use that information, that's exactly what an LLM does, really. So I think you'd be like you say, it's a kind of very enthusiastic person who's walked in through the door, who has read every book, really, and can do a bit of coding, right? But that probably describes a lot of people, really. So and certainly for us, it's the opportunity and the kind of the challenge is to add value beyond that, really. Yeah.
In very simple terms, I could say that it's going to be a time saver for everyone. You would be able to do it like within 1 hour, but with these tools, you could be able to do it within 5 minutes, something like that, as simple as that.
Just wanted to get your input on something that I've been thinking about. For the coming future, for the next 5 years, maybe a decade, all of us who have been coding for a while, we know what is a better way. We can see what ChatGPT is giving us and can correct it, and because of our experience, we have done a junior developer's job. But in the future, if a developer's job is to use AI and then to correct it, the people in the future are not going to have that experience of being a junior developer. So what position will they be, and how will the future be like? I don't know how to phrase that.
Interesting question. I mean, to kind of classic thing here, I'm going to defer that a little bit to the colleagues, people from Datatonic that were talking earlier on. Okay. We're curious what your take on it is, really. What's your take on this and the impact it'll have really on the industry? I've got my opinions, but what's the kind of the considered, say, Datatonic opinion on this?
Pass it on to one of my colleagues too. My thought with this is that it's like working with a really powerful IDE. Like if you look back years ago and how much it changed. I spent a lot of my time in Microsoft BI stack in big chunk of my career, and Microsoft were really big at one point about visual programming, throwing a lot of money into kind of interact with tools to code rather than coding itself. And where I see the evolution potentially with this is that down those lines, what you were saying earlier, the job will evolve, your role will evolve. This will take many phases, and there's lots of pitfalls, in my opinion. A big elephant in the room with all this for me is lack of legislation around AI development right now. This reminds me 20 years ago where data and analytics was, before the privacy laws and all that came in, like GDPR and all that, and completely changed how numbers were crunched, how data was consumed, harvested, stored. My personal take is I think there's lots of unknowns before we can absolutely predict the future. But in simple terms, it would be, as tech evolves, we're all going to evolve, right? But I don't see completely deprecating like a role of a developer. It will just be an evolved version. Like analytics engineer didn't exist a few years ago, right?
I mean, one positive I've been experiencing with this is I can't program in JavaScript or Python much, but now I can, because I can actually get, the first version of our chatbot I wrote myself using JavaScript by getting this to help me. So it's a real kind of like, in some respects, it's a real kind of booster to your skills. As all the things that you can't do currently because you haven't had time to learn them, you can have those skills. You can at least be competent or able to get something going in that area. So in some respects, if you're a driven developer, then it means that in fact you can have superpowers in some respects. So it's interesting one. But the other question to yourself really is, if in the end this is all being processed by an LLM, right? Are we going to need intricate data models? And are we going to need all the kind of stuff we do? If you think about what we do with analytics engineering, it's a very long curated process of building these kind of models and these data mappings and so on. What if in the end, this is the thing that actually disrupts data analytics engineering completely, really? And we do get to a point of kind of, in fact, actually, David, where's David gone again? I mean, so David, you've obviously got a vested interest in this, but can you see how essential is the semantic model to what you're doing, really? Or can you imagine a situation where you would be able to almost sort of, work out the structures and the meaning of data yourself anyway, using the LLMs that you use?
I think it needs supervision. So we could use the LLMs to generate the semantic layer, but then someone would need to check that it wasn't making stuff up like you've seen, right? But then once they've done that, you're talking about you could generate a semantic layer very, very quickly doing that with less resource, but perhaps more senior resource, and then that's ready to go. And then you can use something like Delphi on top.
And one last point on that as well is one area I do think is a risk is we had a couple of junior developers on our team, right? And we were very conscious actually that actually the quality of what they would be producing was probably not that different from what you'd get from this, really. And the danger actually, it cuts out that bottom level of the kind of career path where, actually you've got to be very valuable before you're actually even relevant in this space. Or it could be actually these become a way that even the most junior person can become very valuable. So who knows? I mean, I think, really to some extent we're making it up, but gentleman there as well. Yeah.
Earlier, prompt engineering.
Well, yeah. What prompt engineering is the answer, or it's not the answer? Yeah.
What's going to be the answer?
Yeah.
So you have to learn.
Yes, in the same way that you have to know how to use Google, don't you, as well? I mean, there's a trick to using Google. Although actually you can see with some of those plugins for ChatGPT that there are now prompts, there are now plugins that craft the right prompt for you. Although that, again, it's how's it going to know what to put in there?
But it's just adding to that point. That's what I was trying to allude to in terms of the concept of visual programming that existed. The idea is that you have pre-built components and you interact with it, and that's spinning up all the underlying code, whether it's command line or JSON, whatever, right? So I do see evolution around there, and the engineers are interacting with it. But my take on that and connecting the dots with Christelle's earlier presentation is users are directly interacting with, do you know what I mean? Like a prompt to get the insights they want. So we're talking profound kind of cutting through the chase to get to the answers. And to David's point earlier, like, again, connecting the two dots here is that it is getting better at a rapid pace. My personal thing that potentially could slow this down is any regulation that comes in. That's the big unknown for me personally. But do you totally agree with you
But is that not? I mean, that's interesting. I mean, you get regulation maybe about the information that what goes into those models, and you can imagine, you know, even now Twitter and Reddit with their limiting their APIs is all about saying, well, actually, your training data actually has a value. You should be paying for it. But actually, in the use of it, the genie's out of the bottle, really, isn't it? I mean, if let's say the EU bans the use of LLMs and this technology for doing what we're doing now, I don't know, Singapore will do it, or Hong Kong will do it, or, you know, the technology's out of the bag, really, isn't it now? I can see.
I agree with you. I think, sorry to interrupt this part. I think where I see the threat potentially to the pace of development is that if regulation burden comes in, where you're now having to put a massive kind of compliance and governance framework that makes the pace of this a lot more expensive than it is today. Whereas today, at the moment, it's going on a breakneck speed without too much thinking into various areas of, you know, privacy, compliance, and all that kind of stuff. That's what I meant, rather than putting the genie back in the bag.
Yeah, exactly. So any other questions on this at all, or observations? Yeah.
With all the talk, what do you think in the future? Are we going to get any like defensive generative AI? Because now you can have AI give us access key to your database. I manage my system. How can I systematically block that to realize you're actually the person, not like agent?
Okay. Any thoughts on that?
So I think, again, my thought here would be what David was talking about. You know, there's a bit of checks and balances, and things are still evolving. So that part is, in my view, is that it's still being worked out. But
cop-out answer.
Yeah. Well, no, I think but the straight thing would be it's risky at the moment when you look at it in terms of potential, right? Because there's been examples out there in other regions, certain part of the world, where AI, and especially around fraud and all that kind of stuff, where you can't even tell that they're non-human. You know what I mean? In terms of even face, you know, image generation, video image, how it's interacting, you know, it's faking kind of. I don't know if you guys saw the Bitcoin stuff, the scam that's going out there, right? I'm bringing that home to your conversation, is that there's a lot of potential out there. This is what I was talking about in terms of regulation. Once some of the regulatory framework comes in, and EU at the moment, there's some responsible AI stuff that's going through European Parliament to be legislated in terms of the development of it, that I think will potentially kind of compel the development of it to put some guardrails.
What will the constraint be, though? I mean, in what way will it be constrained, do you think?
So I think, so for example, in terms of processing the data, right?
Yeah.
Like how the example you gave earlier about, okay, you're going to take a ton of documents and then put it on a vector database. If you're compelled to then manage each of the shards and all of the, you know, personal, all of that, and also the biases. And my colleagues did some amazing demos as well, but responsible AI and all that, this is how data protection was 25 years ago. It's self-regulated. You're saying responsible AI and bias, it's people are writing their own rules. Once that's written into regulation, you'll be like, okay, I can't do this development because I have to take these regulatory compliance into a question. Well, you mentioned about security. If there's specific regulations around you're not allowed to develop or you're not allowed to touch certain areas, that's to be worked out. At the moment, it's a scary picture. I think if I'm able to kind of just be frank, because it's completely, development is kind of self-regulated. That was my thought.
I was just going to say on the security point, what we found is that there's a number of startups coming out which use AI to essentially regulate other AI bad actors. So they can recognize fake AI generated content. They can recognize many different things that AI has created that it shouldn't have. With the legislation, I think it's going to be really difficult because at the moment, some kid can just like torrent an LLM and start using it, right? And you know, we saw how good the government was at regulating torrents back in the day. So I think it's genie's out, genie's out the bottle. Yeah. I don't want to hit your head again.
Just on like what Ash was saying, what you're saying about regulation, this might sound a bit old man chat in the clouds, but like I've seen that you just happily give the LLMs like access to your repos, your PI, your PII data. What are the repercussions of that? Are you just, have you got clients that you're uploading data to? Like, where does this sort of live?
We are okay. So to be clear on that, we are kind of careful on that. So no client data that's confidential would go into that. You know, but things about our processes, you know, and kind of I suppose things that we would share internally. That about, I think it makes sense to put in there. But yeah, you've got things like PII because once it's been added to training data for an LLM, it's probably you can't get it back, can you? Really?
Yeah, like the same. You said that you'd like your Slack messages and that.
Yeah.
Again, there's going to be personal sort of stuff in there. That's.
Yeah.
So I just wonder, yeah, what's happening with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Depending on my 2 cents, there was that depending on the regulation, the process can become super expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Versus how it's going to.
I think we're at the experimenting stage at the moment. So, you know, it's certainly there's good points there. I mean, there's obviously a distinction between internal, external, and so on. But yeah, PII and confidential stuff. Obviously, was it Samsung recently that were using ChatGPT to do their chip designs, and they paid their chip designs part of the training data. So it's at the very least, we always make sure we use the option to keep our stuff private and so on. But yeah, you're right. I think it's the regulation side is interesting, really. Cool. Yeah, the question.
Oh, that's an easy one.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mark, to do with your question about what the regulation might look like, first of all, I'd urge all the bright people here, maybe look for a job at the ICO or the Turing Institute and help form that regulation, because we need those places, those places need the bright brains. No point the head of OpenAI turning up in Congress and saying, we need regulation if he doesn't provide his top engineers. Then you'll get the regulation quicker and everyone will and the regulation will be better and everyone will benefit. But to answer one of your questions about what the regulation may look like, take something like the Martin Lewis thing last week, you know, the money saving expert guy who had his persona generated and pretended, and the persona generated pretended to recommend something, which he would never do, and people got scammed by that. Perhaps it could be as simple as, if you're a living person, that is not allowed. You know, you have rights over your image. So that's one thought, right? Question for you, though, to do with that sort of security and privacy thing, you know, with your example about your IP going into the vector database, and then you had the dotted lines going up and down to the back end, right? So what exactly were you passing across, given that that was your IP and you had your own, I think it was your if you like, your vector database?
Yeah. The way it works is that you take your content and it becomes it gets sliced up, made into embeddings, or whatever, and that is then sent along with the prompt to ChatGPT. And actually, in that case, it's a bit of a con, actually, because all ChatGPT is doing in that instance is basically formatting and composing the reply, right? So it's not itself in that case actually kind of so there's a difference between, I suppose, training a model and fine tuning it and sending information as part of the prompt. So what it's doing in that case there is ChatGPT, with the option to not send your data as training data to OpenAI, is composing the response, really. Okay, in that case there. So it's actually a two-stage process there. You've got the bit there with our IP that sits in a vector database, and ChatGPT is a conversational thing, really. Yeah, but you can imagine at some point you'd be saying, can I? And actually, there are ways out there of training your own LLMs with your own data in. And once it gets released, then that's obviously hard to get out again. But it's clearly an area that needs a lot of thought, as my kind of cop-out answer would be. So yes, yeah. I've run out of time now. Okay, well, look, yeah, okay. Well, look, it's been great speaking to you about this. I hope it was interesting and staying. No, I think that's it actually now. I think, let's have a look. Oh, that was it. That was it. That was the payoff bit there. So hopefully that URL works. But anyway, if you're interested in more, there's 2 blogs I've written on Medium, one about this, which is the full details, and one last week about doing data analysis with this as well. But read those, speak to me afterwards or whatever, and it's good fun, really. So scary, but fun. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for spacing all the grilling. That was really interesting. Well, thank you very much, guys. As I mentioned, just recap of some of the events and all that are coming up, and stay tuned for more content. I'd like to say though, if my colleague Christelle, it seemed a bit patchy, I do have a confession to make. We had another speaker from Octopus Energy in mind. He, due to sickness, had to pull out last minute. So we did what we said there about tying in the generative AI to the discovery API. If you do have questions, reach out to me. Very early stages. When we say stay tuned for content, hopefully next time we'll have something there for you, but we weren't prepared today. So thank you for your understanding. And yeah, please share your feedbacks with us. Hopefully we can still pick up some of the networking time, and yeah, bombard Mark with more questions if necessary. Yeah, and thank you very much. Yeah, let's mingle. So much to think about.
That whole point is either you literally have control concept. I want to ride the wave.